Somewhere in the drifting snow of ancient Europe, maybe around the 7th century, a man named Ulfrid was trying to light a fire with flint and steel, while muttering gentle threats at his own numb fingers. The wind howled outside his wooden hut, a cheerful reminder that winter never RSVP'd. It simply showed up, kicked the door off its hinges, and moved right in. Europe, during those chillier centuries, was a frigid buffet of snowdrifts, smoked meats, and long, slow survival strategies. Winters weren't endured so much as outwitted, with no heated blankets, no central heating, and no socks from your aunt in the mail. Our ancestors had to get impressively, almost poetically, scrappy. Cozy, even, in the most bone-chilling sense. Let's start with the hut. Many early Europeans lived in what we might generously call semi-insulated rustic domiciles, or to be more accurate, wooden boxes with dreams. In places like Anglo-Saxon England, the walls were wattle and daub, wooden strips woven together like horizontal lasagna and smeared with a mixture of mud, straw, and sometimes cow dung for that extra rustic charm. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked, sort of. Wind had preferences, and those tiny gaps between the walls were all-you-can-blow buffets. Still, with a smoky hearth and some furs strategically nailed up where the breezes got frisky, it almost resembled comfort. Now, about that fire. Keeping warm involved more than just piling logs in a hearth. Fire was life, heat, and occasionally an uninvited roommate if the thatch roof caught a little too quickly. It had to be tended constantly. Not for cooking, though we'll get to porridge in a moment, but because once the fire went out, reigniting it in freezing weather was somewhere between mildly catastrophic and emotionally devastating. Clothing was another key to not turning into a people popsicle. Long woolen tunics, layered thickly, like lasagna again. Lasagna is apparently the metaphor of choice tonight. And cloaks, glorious scratchy cloaks, pinned with bronze brooches and worn noticeably in bed. Underwear, optional. Depends how fancy you were feeling at the time. But enough about roofs and drafts. Let's talk about food, because winter was essentially 5 months straight of trying not to starve. Crops didn't grow much under 3 feet of snow, so food storage was serious business. Root cellars were early medieval magic, dug right into the frostbitten earth and lined with straw or clay. These cool, semi-moist caves kept turnips, onions, and skepticism alive all winter. Turnips especially. Those were basically the MVP of winter diets. You could mash them, boil them, roast them, or simply complain about them until spring. And of course, porridge. Ah yes, the endless parade of porridge. Barley, oats, rye, all simmered with water into a chewy, steaming mass that smelled vaguely of survival and resignation. Sometimes folks found a lonely scrap of pork fat or dried berries to stir in, which turned it into a celebration, akin to modern-day brunch, if brunch came with fewer mimosas and more accident-prone axes. Fermentation, that delightful friendship between time and yeast, also kept spirits up, literally. Mead was warm, honeyed, and comfortingly flammable. Beer was actually safer than water in many places, and low alcohol enough to be shared with toddlers, monks, and goats. Preserved foods like smoked fish, salted meats, and pickled vegetables all came out of their hidey holes in the darker months. You'd eat quietly in a smoky hall, using your knife as both utensil and vague social statement. At night, families huddled together in the warmest corner of the home, which often wasn't far from the animals. Livestock weren't just food in waiting, they were natural heaters. One well-placed pig could warm a whole room if you were both patient and comfortable with porcine elbowing. and they sang. Winter nights were long and candle-stretched, so they sang old songs, some joyful, some bizarrely about eels, and told stories handed down in the flicker light. Oral tradition was their Spotify, their bedtime playlist, their folklore-filled security blanket. So somehow, wrapped up in wool and hope, they made it. Not glamorously, not entirely healthily, but together. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, while the fire crackles low, and Ulfred leans back against his smoky wall of questionable structural integrity, let's quietly tiptoe towards stories of snow, silence, and survival, just a little deeper still. By the time the first snowflakes drifted down onto the thatched rooftops of early European villages, the entire population had already entered a curious seasonal ritual best described as total domestic hibernation, with chores. You see, unlike bears, who simply curled up in caves with no forwarding address, humans had to keep fires stoked, children clothed, and goats from eating something structurally vital. In those quieter, darker months, time slowed, almost as if the sun itself was under a particularly heavy wool blanket. The days were short, the nights long, and nearly everything smelled gently of smoke and onions. Not because onions were always cooking, but because everyone had hung them from the rafters months earlier, and they refused to mind their business. The houses themselves were miracles of insulating creativity. Walls were stuffed with mud and straw, and windows, if one was particularly fancy, were sealed with thin animal membranes or oiled parchment to keep out the wind. Essentially, if your home didn't look at least partially edible, you weren't doing it right. For those living in wooden longhouses in the north, places where winter rarely sent an RSVP because it was perpetually in residence, families, animals, and insects all took up communal lodging under one large, cozy roof. Privacy was conceptual, and the air was thick with body heat, hearth smoke, and the sarcastic screeches of chickens who absolutely did not ask to be this involved in human domesticity. One of the cleverest strategies for surviving these winters wasn't found in weapons or warriors, but in wool. And if wool were a person, it would have been crowned monarch of the season and given its own feast day in November. Entire flocks of short-legged sheep were prized not for their bravery, which was minimal, but for their fluff, which, after extensive negotiation involving spinning wheels, would end up as tunics, cloaks, socks, and the ever-essential underpants of extreme endurance. Children were bundled like cabbage rolls, immobilized in so many layers they could only wobble, not run, which some parents described as a happy seasonal perk. Older folks, with their endlessly useful trait of sitting still and knowing things, would often be stationed near the fire, telling stories, chewing on dried apples, and casting suspicious glances at the bread to see if it was rising correctly. Spoiler, it rarely was, but no one let that stop dinner. Meals, when they weren't just something hardy with a turnip, were calorie-packed affairs. The goal was to keep everyone full, warm, and only mildly resentful of snow's omnipresence. Root vegetables played a starring role. Carrots, leeks, cabbages. All the humble, slow-to-rot celebrities of the medieval pantry. If it grew underground and didn't taste dangerous, it was probably on the menu. And let us not forget the high art of the preserved. Winter larders were crammed with salted meats, smoked fish, dried beans, pickled everything, and mysterious jars labelled with untranslatable scribbles that may or may not have been judgmental comments from Grandma. Bathing during these icy months was mostly theoretical. Once the snow arrived, water became something you thought about fondly, but from a respectful distance. Occasionally, a brave soul might stand in a tub near the hearth, attempt a splash and dash, and instantly regret it. Honestly, personal hygiene in winter often boiled down to layer cleverly and wait until it's raining again. Outside, the world thickened into a hush, the kind of silence only snow can create, when even the birds seemed to tiptoe. Approaching footsteps were muffled by thick furs and thick snow, only announced by the occasional crunch that said, rather gently, "Yes, I'm still alive, and I may be carrying a bucket of water or an existential crisis." With villagers largely holed up indoors, time was marked not by sunrises, but by the sounds of daily ritual. The crackle of fires, the mutter of spinning wheels, the occasional argument over whether that was a raccoon or cousin Edgar rustling in the granary again. And as twilight folded gently over, the rooftops once more, families curled near the hearth, warming their toes, telling old tales, and watching the flames dance across the walls. Outside, the snow ticked softly against the shutters like a white, whispering clock. Yet, even as the cold deepened, a curious warmth stirred within, not just from the fire, but from the many small, clever ways humanity endured with cabbage in its stew and wool in its socks. And before long, we'll step quietly over the frozen threshold and peek into the curious customs of how people kept themselves entertained and occasionally bewitched during long, silent evenings that stretch past the edge of imagination. Of all the legendary foes humanity has squared off against, raging beasts, rival tribes, the occasional cousin who insists the world is flat, perhaps none has been so persistently aggravating as winter, especially the European variety. We're talking about the kind of winter where your bread freezes quicker than your bad ideas, where snowdrifts quietly annex your doorway, and your goat gives you a look like, "You brought me into this for what again?" Now, let's forget the flaming torches and dramatic battle cries. The true, unsung heroes of ancient European winters were socks. Yes, socks. Woolen ones, to be exact. Early Europeans, clever in the way that people become after realizing snow can sneak into places it should never be, turned to their trusty sheep for warmth. Not hugs, though a sheepy cuddle wouldn't have gone amiss, but wool, layered, looped, and wrapped in a fashion that bordered on obsessive. Archaeologists have unearthed remnants of ancient sock-like foot wrappings, carefully contoured to toes that had clearly said, "Enough is enough." But of course, it wasn't all about feet. Whole families became walking bundles of textiles. Wearing layer upon layer of wool, flax and fur, they waddled around their damp, smoky huts, looking less like warriors and more like well-read sausages. The fashionable winter attire of, say, a Neolithic dad was a mismatched ensemble that added 10 layers and subtracted the ability to sit down with dignity. And if you're wondering whether these layers itched, yes, magnificently so. To combat winter, families also turned their homes into engineering marvels of tolerable dampness. You may picture a charming log cabin with a bubbling hearth, but ancient European dwellings often had more in common with sunken hobbit huts. Many were earth-sheltered structures, dug partially into the ground, not for aesthetic minimalism, mind you. This was pure, chilly survival. Let no frostbite befall those who live like a mole. These semi-subterranean homes, found from Scotland to the Slavic hills, offered insulation against the winter's bite. Once snugly inside, families would close heavy wooden doors, if they had any, and hang thick wool or animal hides over any cracks bold enough to let in a draft. Windows, if they existed, they were small, intentionally ineffective, and likely covered in something semi-translucent, like stomach lining or carefully scraped bladder. You can't make this stuff up. Well, you can. But the ancient Estonians already did. The hearth, though. Ah, the hearth. This was the glowing heart of the household. Logs, peat, or in some cases dried animal dung, would be fed into the fire, releasing not just warmth, but a fine bouquet of smoky perfume strong enough to startle your ancestors from 3 generations prior. Overhead, the thick thatch roofing would blacken with soot, and occasionally house a mouse who had written a tiny will and embraced the warmth of mid-air retirement. And within this dim, warmish cocoon, stories would bloom. Oral tales passed from generation to generation became winter's other kind of insulation. People gathered close, not just for heat, but for connection. Children wide-eyed with the magic of some ancient tale, elders savouring the rare luxury of memory being heard. Some stories were dramatic epics of lost kings and frost giants. Others were cautionary parables like "Don't eat snow with yellow bits," all vital forms of knowledge. And while we're on the subject of practical survival tips, the chamber pot. Dear listener, let's delicately observe that leaving the house in the dark winter night to relieve oneself was a foolish errand best avoided. Instead, well, let's just say Europe perfected the intimate science of indoor arrangements. If you've ever had the misfortune of stubbing a toe in the dark, imagine your ancestors navigating a dim, smoky hut in fur-lined underpants while trying not to upend the family's designated receptacle. High-stakes midnight missions. Still, amidst all the shivering and runny-nosed resilience, winter brought a kind of sacred slowness. The land blanketed under snow meant no ploughing, no planting. Time itself seemed to exhale. People repaired tools, told stories, cherished silence, even meditated over fermented cabbage, better known now as sauerkraut, the unsung crisp sidekick of long, preserved winters. Because when the snow drifts high and the sun impersonates a flickering candle, you look at your jar of cabbage and think, well, you and me again, friend. And thus the snow fell softly outside, while inside the quiet hum of life survived, scratchy, smoky, sometimes cabbage-scented, but defiantly warm. They weren't fighting winter, not really. They were negotiating terms, and over countless frosts and thaws, they started to develop tricks and tools to tip the deal ever so slightly in their favour. Now, what were those tools exactly? Well then, that's a frosty little tale waiting just ahead. As winter's breath swept across the crooked forests and stone-walled villages of medieval Europe, people turned to their most loyal companions, animals, fat, wool, and the art of knowing when to stay very, very still. Let's start with pigs. Yes, pigs. Before central heating, before insulation, even before socks with separate toes, ancient Europeans found themselves relying on animals for more than breakfast. Come December, that pink, snorting friend in the corner of a timber frame house wasn't just a future sausage. It was a gentle, grunting radiator. Peasants often shared their living space with livestock, not out of affection, although a warm cow can be hard to resist, but mainly because of something we now call biothermal heat. A sheep in the corner, rustic heating system, a couple chickens roosting in the rafters, feathery furnace, and a pig curled up by the hearth. That was just responsible architecture. Now, these living hot water bottles were only part of the solution. the walls themselves got involved, though not always with much enthusiasm. Most homes were built with wattle and daub, the medieval equivalent of cardboard and wishful thinking. That's woven wooden slats plastered with a mixture of mud, straw and manure. Yes, you heard that right. Medieval insulation involved mud pies and cow pies smeared lovingly onto your cottage walls. But inside, things were actually rather cozy. Though cozy here means smoky, cramped and riddled with fleas. Still, people made do. Thick woolen tapestries were hung on walls to add a layer of draft protection and provide something to stare at while pretending to enjoy boiled turnip again. Floors were strewn with rushes, often sprinkled with fragrant herbs like lavender or mint, which helped mask the smell of everything else, including the pig. And then there were cloaks. Oh, the cloaks. Thick layers of wool draped like portable fortresses around the shoulders. If you were lucky, it had a fur trim. Not for style, although, let's not lie, fur looks good. But for extra warmth, especially around the neck and head. And hoods weren't just for dramatic entrances. They kept the snow off and warmth in. In fact, people in medieval Europe were champions of layering, likely centuries ahead of modern fashion advice. Linen undergarments, woolen tunics, outer cloaks, and for the aristocracy, maybe even a fine silk layer somewhere in the middle. Useless for warmth, but good for reminding everyone that you didn't shear the sheep yourself. Sleeping arrangements also got creative, especially as nights grew longer and temperatures plunged. The bed wasn't just a wooden frame with some straw. It was often an enclosed box or a curtained nook, something to trap body heat and possibly body odor. Families would sometimes all sleep in the same bed, a practice charmingly known as warming the sheets together. Add the family dog, a couple children, and maybe a rogue goose, and you've got an efficient medieval heating grid. There were also more inventive solutions, like the humble bed warmer, a pan with a long handle filled with embers slid under the covers before bedtime. An ancient ancestor to our electric blanket, though infinitely more flammable. And then there were the more aromatic solutions. It wasn't uncommon to wear the same garments day and night for weeks on end. Changing clothes meant uncovering skin, and skin plus winter wind equals frostbite. So, less washing, more wool. Life was cold. Better to smell like cheese than become an icicle. When things got especially bad, entire villages would enter a sort of sleepy mode. Work slowed, life quieted. It was called the dead of winter for a reason. People huddled, told stories, drank heavily spiced ale, and waited for the sun to remember them again. All of it, from the hay-stuffed boots to the soot-speckled ceilings, paints a picture that is colder, smellier, and yet somehow cozier than we often imagine. It turns out survival wasn't all about braving the elements. It was about outsmarting them with a clever mix of livestock, layering, and the tried and true method of simply staying in bed. Which is where we now leave our medieval dreamers, still tucked tightly beneath the woolen folds of shared beds and flickering candlelight. As the snow deepened outside and smoke drifted lazily from thatch roofs, the quiet ingenuity of winter life carried on. And just beyond that wintry stillness, in the cold stone corners of castles and manor halls, other sorts of humans were practicing their own rituals of warmth. By the time the snow piled up past the knees of Roman merchants and Celtic druids alike, ancient Europeans had a few tricks up their woolen sleeves. Just because their roofs were made of thatch and their heating systems depended largely on fire and hope didn't mean they were entirely helpless. No, survival in winter was a full-time occupation, and in some cases, an art, or possibly a kind of slow-motion team sport played in bear pelts and thick socks, if such things had existed. Let us drift quietly northward for a moment, to the early Germanic tribes. These hearty people, with names that sounded like weather conditions, things like the Chatti, the Swabi, and the Franks, knew winter was less a season and more a predatory animal that liked to loiter outside the house. So they did what many clever creatures do. They burrowed. Not into the literal earth, though some houses were half sunken to trap warmth, but into their clusters of low-built homes, designed like hugging stones. Roofs were pitch steep to slide off the snow like a shy child in gym class, and walls were often thick with mud, straw, and dreams of spring. Inside, the fire in the hearth crackled like an old man telling stories, and people did what anyone does in winter: eat too much, complain about the weather, and knit things they never finish. Though they didn't call it hygge back then, that would come later and further north. The early Germanic mindset had a similar flavor. Community was warmth. If you shared food, space, and the gossip about who may or may not have cursed the cow last Tuesday, you had a fair chance at making it to April with all your toes. Still, not all winters were snow globes filled with cozy contentment. Sometimes food ran short, and that's when the more, shall we say, resourceful winter traditions came into play. Take the practice of blood preservation. A cheerful subject, I know. But in December, when livestock were slaughtered to reduce the mouths that needed feeding, not a shred of the animal went to waste. Not the hide, not the hooves, not even the clotted dreams inside. The blood of pigs, goats, and even cattle was carefully collected, stirred with oats or flour, and patterned into a variety of sausages and puddings not fit for a children's menu. Blood sausage, known in various regions by names like Blutwurst, black pudding, or the winter hunger has sent us into madness delight, was a cold season staple. Protein-rich, shelf-stable, and almost definitely an acquired taste. It also doubled as a good test of friendship. If your hosts offered it, you were either very welcome or very unlucky. In the Celtic lands of what we now call Ireland and Scotland, winter survival had added flavour in the form of storytelling. The ancient bards understood that a good tale could warm the soul better than mead. And unlike mead, you couldn't run out of it as long as someone kept exaggerating. Fireside storytelling became ritual, bonding entertainment with history, myth, and a bit of casual slander tucked into the verses. These stories travelled faster than anyone in snowshoes and helped keep both morale and oral tradition alive. Plus, nothing combats seasonal gloom quite like a dramatic saga involving sword-wielding heroes, magic cows, and the occasional talking salmon. Further east, Slavic villages braced against the freeze by organising community events like the Koliada, a winter festival with singing, costumes, and ritual visits to neighbours' homes, sort of an early version of caroling, but with more ceremonial bread and slightly more supernatural themes. During these festivities, people dressed up as bears, goats, or spirits that looked suspiciously like Uncle Miko in a fur hat, and paraded through the village asking for food, drink, or attention, depending on the year. It was fun, it was festive, and most importantly, it kept everyone moving. A key defense against becoming one with the snowdrift. Even sleeping arrangements were strategic. Families often slept close together for warmth, with the cattle housed just a wall away, or in the same space entirely, if the architecture and level of intimacy allowed. While this broke every modern zoning ordinance and probably smelled like folklore, it did help keep temperatures above the icy regret level. Yes, ancient Europeans knew how to huddle, humour, and hang on through the long, cold months. They may not have had space heaters or thermal underwear, but they had each other, and an endless supply of stews, stories, and audible sighs about the weather. And as the wind quiets, its howl and frost paints its silver upon the corners of the hearth, let us wander in blankets and dreams into the curious kitchens of those long ago winters, where even the water tried to turn to stone, and yet soups still simmered gently, waiting for the next spoonful. As the snow piled high outside their timbered walls, and the wind curled around cottage eaves like a nosy ghost with cold fingers, ancient Europeans turned to one of winter's most beloved and questionable companions, the communal bed. Far from the romantic scenes painted in modern films, these shared sleeping arrangements were less candlelit intimacy and more feet in your face. Picture this. In a modest one-room hut in, say, a Carpathian valley, a family of 6 to 10. Throw in a grandmother, a goat, and possibly a guest named Björn, who wandered in during the Yule festivities, all squeezed into a single sleeping space. Separate bedrooms, luxury, even straw partitions, extravagance. Here warmth was the goal, and personal space was but a summer fantasy. Beds were often box-like wooden frames with walls, more cradle than mattress, meant to keep out winter drafts and, ideally, retain body heat. Think of them as the historical version of a group chat you couldn't leave. Everyone had something to say, usually snoring, and muting wasn't an option. Children often sprawled across parents. Chickens were stashed under beds for thermal efficiency, and midnight clucking. Sometimes elders were given the warmest central spots, not necessarily out of respect, but because cold toes in old age lead to louder complaints. And in households that could build a hearth inside, the favoured sleeping spot would be as close to the fire as flammably possible. Blankets, sure, a few, typically made from wool, layered with animal hides, and smelling faintly of the sheep they once were. But it was bodies, not bedding, that did the heavy lifting in keeping winter's bite at bay. This was not unique to one region. Across snowy swaths of Europe, from mist-swept Scandinavian settlements to the frost-laced meadows of early Slavic villages, shared beds were commonplace. In some cultures, it was considered healthy for people to sleep side by side. They called it kin warmth, although, on bitter nights, it was more like kin pressure, especially when Aunt Hilda insisted on warming her icy feet on someone else's calves. And in case you're wondering, no, people did not change into ornate embroidered pajamas. For most villagers, sleepwear was simply the clothes you didn't bother to take off because doing so risked hypothermia. Or, if you were truly committed to warmth, you might wrap up in sleep tunics, oversized linen or woolen garments, which looked like sad medieval nightgowns and probably smelled like damp hay and effort. Underwear, in the winter, was optional and often discouraged, because laundry involved breaking apart frozen river ice and scrubbing fabric on rocks like a very disappointed raccoon. Meanwhile, out in the alpine hamlets, homes were crafted with low ceilings and thick walls, theorized to keep heat better, and perhaps to minimize how far warmth could rise up and escape. The main room, kitchen, bedroom, and hopefully chicken pen were all economically and aromatically combined. A fire roared near the center, its smoke curling upward through an intentional gap in the thatched roof called the smoke hole. The same hole also let in snowflakes, small birds, and occasional regrets. In Germanic regions, they embraced stove beds, not beds shaped like stoves, but actual sleeping lofts built atop broad masonry stoves. These were the heated heroes of the household, radiating warmth long after the fire had gone out. Children might be ushered up into these toasty perches like baked potatoes, still wrapped in their dinner tunics. The only drawback: climbing up cold stone steps in the middle of the night for, let's say, urgent reasons, was brisk business, but not everyone huddled in familial bundles. In monastic communities perched in the northern climes, wintry nights came with austere slumbering practices. Monks slept in stone cells, often alone, beneath rough woolen blankets and above planks that made tree bark look soft. Mortification of the flesh, they called it. Heat, apparently, was part of the temptation. Still, even monks weren't completely unreasonable. During the coldest months, exceptions were occasionally granted for an extra layer or, hold your censer, heated stones wrapped in cloth, slipped under their beds to take the edge off. One could almost hear the muffled sigh of a medieval abbot reluctantly allowing, just this once, a touch of earthly comfort. So each night, through snowstorms and icy drafts, ancient Europeans bundled together as best they could, man, beast, and occasionally monk, united by the cold and the hope that morning would bring fire, food, maybe even a patch of unfrozen ground. And as the candle wore low and the last ember crackled in the hearth, somewhere in one of those knee-high beds, a peasant rolled over, bumped an uncle, elbowed a pig, and drifted deeper into a sleep that would carry him just far enough to dream of warmer nights. Not too far away, outside the foggy window pane, the season quietly continued, a long and frosty symphony, and life, as ever, found a way to stay warm. Come morning, they'd rise to new challenges, and perhaps a howling reminder of winter's next act. As winter deepened across the craggy highlands and forested valleys of medieval Europe, the noble art of not freezing to death took on many forms, some clever, some profoundly weird, and some suspiciously involving a lot of onion-based solutions. Let us now shuffle quietly into one of the most surprising sanctuaries against the cold, the humble bed, which at the time was about as humble as a throne made of geese. Now, modern beds are fine and polite things, supportive, mathematically balanced, named after celestial beings like Tempur-Pedic. But back then, a bed wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a major defensive weapon in the war against winter. For wealthier families with a certain flair for drama, the bed was enclosed on all sides with heavy curtains and possibly a carved canopy, forming an elaborate wooden cocoon. These were known as box beds, or sometimes tester beds, which sounds like something a medieval wizard might keep in their tower, and honestly, not far from the truth. Climbing into one was like entering a small wooden fortress, protected from drafts, ghosts, and possibly taxes. Inside this curtained chrysalis, entire families, or at least a few siblings, might sleep huddled together, borrowing warmth from each other like medieval hot water bottles with names like Ethelred or Gunhilda. Dogs might be invited too, not out of affection necessarily, but because they were functional, ambulatory radiators with reliable thermostat systems. In colder regions like Scandinavia, the Norse didn't mess around. They layered up in woolen tunics, cloaks, and fur-lined hats that would impress the sternest of Arctic foxes. But even that wasn't enough when faced with an Icelandic gust that had been sharpening its knives since November. So, they hunkered down into tightly built turf houses, half buried in the earth, with sod walls and tiny windows that let in just enough light to remind everyone how very dark it still was. These houses were warm, yes, but also smoky, dim, and extremely aromatic if you happen to own a goat. In such homes, the hearth wasn't just a feature, it was the nucleus of life. People didn't gather around the fire so much as orbit it. To leave the hearth in winter was to say a small prayer and possibly write a will. Fires were fed cautiously, not only because firewood was precious, but because early homes were built with all the flammable enthusiasm of a matchstick factory. The fireplaces themselves were large, open, and smoky, functioning more like stationary clouds than clean-burning stoves. But even with all these defenses, people had to get creative, especially when it came to heating their limbs before climbing into bed. Enter the bed warmer. This mischievously named device was essentially a metal pan filled with embers or hot stones, carried carefully and nervously about under the covers to warm up the sheets. In responsible hands, it brought delicious warmth. In less responsible hands, it brought flame, particularly unfortunate when all your bedding is made from straw, wool, and poorly suppressed terror. Another trick was the use of warming stones, heated rocks wrapped in cloth and tucked into the foot of the bed like sleepy volcanoes. Elegant in its simplicity, utterly effective, and less prone to setting the house on fire than the embers in a pan strategy. Unless, of course, someone forgot to wrap the stone. Then it was more of a surprise foot roast. And let's not forget the ultimate expression of winter resilience, the nightcap. Far from being symbolic of bedtime beers, the nightcap was an actual cap for the night, a snug little bonnet tied under the chin that kept all the precious head heat from evacuating into the cruel upper layers of one's drafty bedroom atmosphere. It seems the human cranium is something of a chimney if left unguarded, and thus the medieval solution was, make everyone look like they're entering a whimsical bonnet pageant. Even more curiously, sleeveless sleeping garments were common. Why? Because arms under blankets fared better pressed politely against the torso, and adding sleeves to a long winter shirt was seen as unnecessary extravagance by many. Essentially, ancient Europeans said, "We'll keep our heads hot and our arms humble." All of these techniques, from the cozy box bed to the goat-scented turf house, tell a story of strange brilliance. People didn't just survive the cold. They learned how to fold themselves into it, to tame it with fire, routine, and a lot of interpersonal snugging. And tomorrow, as you join me once more by the flicker of our imagination's hearth, we'll tiptoe into the forgotten story of winter food. Not just stews, but the year's final harvest, salted dreams, and why every smoked fish was basically a winter insurance policy. As the wind curled itself like a cat around the corners of medieval thatched huts, the people inside remained impressively unbothered. It was winter, after all. Again, who would have thought? And yet, despite the snow piling up like sourdough gone rogue, ancient Europeans had a strange and surprisingly effective way of staying warm without the modern luxury of central heating. Or electric blankets with confident names like Thermocloud X2000. Instead, they had pigs, and they had each other, sometimes, both simultaneously. Let us drift now to a small timber-framed house nestled along the Rhine River, in what today we would call southern Germany. The house is crooked, the beams are complaining with every gust of wind, and there's a smell wafting through the door. Equal parts damp straw, smoked meat, and goat diplomacy. Inside, it's a scene of unexpected coziness, or what the Germans might one day name Gemütlichkeit, if they ever got around to inventing that word. The hearth glows low and orange like a sleepy fox. Cloaks are hung by a log bench, and family members gather around an iron pot steaming with an indescribable stew. turnip, onion, perhaps a bit of dried eel if it was a good harvest, or rat if it wasn't. But the real miracle of warmth in that room isn't the fire or the eel stew. It's insulation and feet. You see, these ancient households weren't just family affairs. They were multi-species bunkers against frostbite. Chickens roosted near the door. Geese honked judgmentally through gaps in the floor. And pigs, sweet sleep-snorting pigs, would nestle beside their humans like rotund radiators in cloven-hoofed pajamas. Modern architects would raise a heavily penciled eyebrow at the structural decision to combine barn and bedroom. Yet these folks understood thermal economics. A warm pig is worth 2 wool coats, as the saying never quite went. But even if one preferred their bedmates of the human variety, there was a strict nightly protocol to ensure a toasty slumber. First, layer up, woolen tunics, layered linen, goose fat balm rubbed on the cheeks, not just for skincare, mind you, but to protect against frostbite. Imagine going to bed wearing all your clothes while greased like a roast chicken. Second, the bed itself, built from timber, perhaps filled with straw or feathers. If you were a noble lucky enough to exploit a number of geese, a medieval bed was as much a fortress against winter as it was a sleeping arrangement. Some had canopies, 4-posted beauties with thick curtains, designed less for drama and more for body heat entrapment. A whole family might sleep in that one bed, lined up like mismatched books on a shelf. Grandmother by the wall, then children, then parents nearer to the fire, and the door regrettably closed to squawking poultry. Personal space? That was a concept reserved for future pandemics and modern introverts. And as they settled in, with pig beside cousin and wool sock against cold foot, the final cherry atop this warm layer cake was the humble bed warmer, a metal pan filled with hot coals and slid between the sheets like a mischievous cookie sheet full of embers. The risk of burning the mattress? High. The reward of toasty toes? Higher. But warmth wasn't physical alone. Stories were as necessary as fire. Tucked snug under furs and blankets of questionable provenance, families passed the hours not with television, but with tales of frost giants, wandering spirits, and occasionally exaggerated descriptions of turnip harvests. Oral traditions kept the mind occupied as the body surrendered to sleep, because nothing says sweet dreams quite like a grandmother whispering about headless ghosts drifting across the moors. Life was hard, yes, but winter, with all its lengthy evenings and excuses to not do outdoor chores, had its own soft rhythm, a slow, layered lullaby that timed itself with the crackling of the fire and the gentle snores of everything in the house, including the pig. So now, as the wind sighs once more across distant rooftops and the last ember glows beneath the iron cauldron, let us wander sleepy-footedly toward the next midnight curiosity and discover why some ancient Europeans preferred to live underground. Curious, isn't it? As the snowflakes drifted silently outside smoky thatched rooftops and stoic wooden beams moaned under the weight of December skies, ancient Europeans did something quite sensible. They stayed indoors, a lot, and then did something altogether less sensible. They invited animals in with them. Yes, welcome to the cozy, occasionally pungent world of early wintertime home design, where the line between barn and bedroom was more of a polite suggestion than an architectural certainty. In the cold months, families didn't just huddle around the hearth, they huddled with livestock, sheep, goats, maybe even the odd chicken if she had seniority. Homes were often multifunctional spaces, one end for people, the other for anything that bleated, mooed, or clucked. a kind of medieval Airbnb arrangement, where the cows got free board and the villagers got passive heating and the occasional pat from a cold, moist nose. This wasn't just rustic ambience or a fondness for mooing company. It was practical. Body heat, human and animal alike, mattered when temperatures dipped, and insulation was primarily made of wool, moss, and sheer stubbornness. So yes, your average 9th century Frank or Saxon might have fallen asleep listening to crackling firewood, the slow drip of melting snow on the roof, and Gertrude the cow chewing cud thoughtfully in the corner. Of course, for those lucky enough to have a bit more wealth, or at least fewer cows, they might have had something rare and deeply luxurious, a room without livestock, perhaps even a separate barn. Civilization at its finest. In those situations, people attempted to warm their homes with braziers or portable stoves, which occasionally led to what could generously be called spontaneous fireplace relocation. It's said that some longhouses met their ends not by the plundering of raiders, but by an ambitious attempt at thermal innovation. Now, beyond shared body heat and careful fire handling, Northern Europeans began to get very clever about staying warm. Consider the bed, a humble invention, yes, but one that underwent a kind of magical transformation in winter. Enter the box bed. Box beds were essentially wooden cabinets you slept inside. Imagine a wardrobe, but instead of hiding from Aslan, you tucked in with a thick woolen blanket and the hope that no one opened the door and let in the draft. The enclosed space trapped warmth like a personal winter cocoon. Popular in places like Brittany, Flanders, and Scotland, these cozy rectangles were often shared by couples, sometimes with children, and, in particularly trusting households, with a cat trained to be a living foot warmer. Purring, a form of medieval central heating. Equally important were the bed coverings. Duvets didn't arrive until the late Middle Ages, thanks to their high-maintenance lifestyle. Stuffs with down, they were light, warm, and impossible to wash. So most folks layered heavy woolen blankets, furs, and, in truly desperate households, spare tunics. One could be forgiven for wondering whether medieval folks dressed for bed, or simply sank into it like another folded garment. Another winter marvel, the bedside warming pan, a long-handled metal pan filled with hot coals and tucked betwixt chilly linens before bedtime. Its job, preheat your sleep. Its side effect, occasionally unintentional bed fires. It was essentially the microwave of the Middle Ages, only slightly more flammable. Users had to time the warming just right. Not so soon that the bed cooled off again. Not so late that they roasted themselves from the thighs down. It was a fine art of timing and trust. Outside windows, if present at all, were stuffed with oiled parchment or animal bladder. Glass was rare and reserved for churches, or the sort of noble household where tapestries covered both stone walls and awkward silences. These translucent patches let in light but kept out drafts. Sort of. Mostly, they just got frosted over the moment anyone in the house mentioned the word January. During especially brutal cold snaps, entire families might sleep in shifts. The older generation would rise earliest to stoke fires, while the younger ones luxuriated under the weight of 5 blankets, 2 tapestries, and a disgruntled sheep. And yet, for all the challenges, there was an odd sort of comfort to it all. The fire always needed feeding. The animals snuffled quietly in their sleep. Someone was always snoring, someone else always muttering in dreams. Winter wasn't endured alone. It was shared. And as night fell on longhouses and stone cottages across Europe, The flickering glow of fire danced on wooden walls, illuminating a portrait of resilience, resourcefulness, and a deeply practical tolerance for living with livestock. Outside, the snow kept falling in patient flurries, and inside, the secrets of staying warm wove quietly onward, one ember at a time. Now, while the hearth glows low and the sheep begin to shift in sleep, we can drift toward another curious corner of European winter life. One where fashion, oddly enough, played a surprising role in surviving the chill. As the snowflakes tumbled from low-hanging pewter skies, ancient Europe slowed its pace to more of a sleepy drift than a march. Winter, for all its chills and inconveniences, gave people something rare, permission to rest, and no one understood this seasonal surrender better than the medieval peasants of Northern Europe, who perfected the fine art of wintertime hibernation without turning into actual bears. Their version of hibernation wasn't quite as dramatic as curling up in a den for 4 months with a belly full of pine cones, but it was, by every sensible account, a slower, dreamier way of surviving the cold. With shorter daylight hours and fewer crops to tend, people slept longer, sometimes up to 14 hours a night. This may sound absurd until you recall that they weren't kept up by the glow of smartphone screens or the midnight whisper of emails. In fact, humans may have once had a natural tendency towards something called segmented sleep, a pattern where you snooze for a few hours, wake up around midnight for an hour or so, to stoke the fire, maybe sip some warm beer, whisper a few prayers, chat about how dark it is, and then drift back into a second sleep till morning. It sounds odd now, but back then, this pattern was as cozy and sensible as wool socks by a fire. Nighttime, especially in winter, wasn't feared. It was revered. Monasteries and early households used the long nights to sink into prayer, reflection, or storytelling. Grandparents took this opportunity to terrify children with ancient legends involving fairy women, frost giants, or mysterious forest beings that could steal your trousers. Stories were an indoor sport in winter, without leagues or uniforms but with plenty of dramatic flair and soup. Now, amid all this resting and reflecting, there was still the matter of survival, which meant staying warm. Homes across medieval Europe bristled with whatever fuel could be scrounged. Wood, peat, dried animal dung, nature's least glamorous fireplace offering, and sometimes even dried seaweed if you lived by the coast and didn't mind the smell of crispy kelp. The grandest innovation in not freezing to death may have been the humble bed. Early peasant beds were often shared, not just between family members but sometimes with livestock. That's right. A goat in your bed wasn't a sign of poor housekeeping. It was central heating. Cows in the lower floor, people upstairs, warmth rising like a well-mannered chimney draft. It wasn't glamorous, but cuddle creature central was an effective survival strategy. In alpine regions, people built thick-walled wooden chalets with steep roofs and big eaves, so the snow would slide off like a melting whipped cream hat instead of collapsing the attic. Families clustered together around a central hearth, the fire sputtering with soft protest beneath an iron pot of whatever was left in the pantry, or vaguely resembled stew. To keep the cold from sneakily crawling under every wooden shutter and through every wall plank, people insulated their homes with more stuff. Thatched roofs were packed tight, window gaps covered with animal hides or oil-treated parchment, medieval DIY insulation at its finest. Woolen wall hangings and tapestries added not just a layer of aristocratic flair, but also a bit of that precious heat-trapping thickness. For the wealthier folk, who lived in manors with stone walls thick enough to stop both a siege and a draft. There were tapestries of biblical scenes and battle victories, all doing double duty as insulation and status signals. Ah yes, that's the depiction of St. George slaying the dragon, while also blocking a frostbite-inducing breeze from my left shoulder. And then there were the clothes. Layering wasn't just a frontier fashion experiment, it was survival. Linen underclothes, then wool, more wool, sometimes quilted outer garments. If you've ever worn so many layers you couldn't scratch your nose, you've basically time traveled to a 12th century January. Hats were essential, even indoors. The cold was not picky about whose head it chilled, but perhaps the crowning glory of medieval winter wear was the foot-warming device known as the bed warmer. A brass or copper pan filled with hot coals. It was gently tucked between blankets before bedtime. Not so gently that it lit anyone on fire, hopefully. These devices did a magnificent job of tricking the bed into thinking it had been kissed by summer, if only for a few minutes. So as the world outside turned to a page of grey and hush, the people inside adapted, not by conquering the cold with extravagant technology or manic productivity, but by leaning into the slowness, bundling up, and letting time thicken like a good stew. Winter wasn't a foe. It was a season made of wool and rest, and warm breath on glass panes, and nestled in their smoky, fur-draped homes, with dreams stitched into every quilt and story steeped in every shadow, they endured, quietly, sleepily. Beyond the hearth's edge, something else stirred, separate from the home, but equally vital. The winter markets and the strange things people bought when no crops were growing. It might surprise you, or not, if you've ever worn wet wool socks, that surviving winter in ancient Europe had a great deal to do with feet. Yes, our ancestors knew that when your toes go numb, the rest of you tends to follow. And while foot warmers might sound like the stuff of Victorian parlours, even before the days of empire and powdered wigs, clever European villagers had their own tricks to keep their extremities from falling off during the frozen months. Let us shuffle into a dim longhouse on a snowy morning in what is now Scandinavia, a kind of IKEA showroom from the Iron Age, minus shelving units and lingonberry sauce. The walls are of wattle and daub, which is a poetic way of saying twig smothered in mud, but it keeps the wind out and the warmth in mostly. A central hearth flickers like the sleepy eyes of an elder who never quite trusts the fire to behave on its own. Around that glow, families gathered like cats to a sunbeam, huddling under furs and wrapped in cloaks that bore patterns both decorative and pragmatic. Runic embroidery might have meant family crest, or just don't mix up with Bjorn's cloak again. On the floor, reed mats acted as insulation between you and the cold, greedy earth below. And when the cold air dared creep in anyway, usually through strategically placed cracks between roof thatchings or the occasional missing wall chink, folk relied on layers, not just clothing, but family members. Sleeping arrangements resembled a very rustic game of sardines, with Granny on one side and the least smelly cousin on the other. Crying dibs on the warmest spot near the fire was a matter of family diplomacy, resolved by age, reputation, or possibly an arm wrestling match involving mittens. Wool, of course, was the kingdom's quiet saviour. Sheep were practically national treasures, not just for meat or milk, but for their coat, which grew fluffier as the night stretched longer. Spinning and weaving became as vital as hunting, and those with good thread tension were local celebrities. Socks were a luxury. often replaced with soft wrappings known as footcloths, and yes, they had to be changed regularly. Otherwise, you'd invent the word trench foot 1,000 years early. Even shoes themselves were designed with the climate in mind. In alpine regions, for instance, people ingeniously stuffed straw and moss into their boots for insulation. It worked surprisingly well, unless, of course, you happen to step in a slush puddle and find your socks transforming into compost. And speaking of footwear, perhaps the height of winter fashion was the pattern. A primitive overshoe invented during the Middle Ages to lift your feet above the icy muck of village streets. Though more common in slightly warmer months, patterns of pattens first appeared in medieval inventories, where the less fortunate just called them wooden things to keep my toes dry. But winter wasn't just survived with warm feet and firelight. It was endured with stories. Oh, how they told stories. Tall ones, short ones, wolf-snarled ones. When the wind howled down the mountainside and shook the walls like a fussy ghost with drafting experience, tales unwound like skeins of yarn before sleep. Folklore and fables danced across flickering walls, characters leaping over shadows as listeners nestled deeper into fur blankets, pressing close to one another, drawing heat both literal and imaginative. In some regions, people believed that telling certain stories during winter could summon dark spirits, or worse, snow that never stopped. So naturally, they told those stories anyway, swapping names and swapping endings to keep things interesting, and to keep the icy spirits guessing, just in case they were listening with frosty ears pressed to the roof. In the heart of winter, food was rationed carefully, with root vegetables reigning supreme, and every now and then, if you'd planned well and hidden it from the teenagers, a bit of smoked meat appeared like a miracle on your wooden plate. Honey, even when crystallized into sweet pebbles, added cheer to porridge and fermented drinks. Let's just say mulled mead could make even the coldest night feel like a mild inconvenience. So the snow fell and kept falling, as it always did. But ancient Europeans, ever inventive, curled deeper into their woolen cloaks and leaned into the flickering stories, each told with the secret knowledge that they had made it through yet another day in a frozen world that barely blinked at human determination. And just beyond the hearth, tucked near the base of a smoky chimney, a curious object glimmered faintly by firelight, a strange little candle in a hollowed turnip. But that, as you might guess, is another tale ready to be lit. And now, we arrive in the smoke-sweet glow of a Bronze Age winter hearth, where survival didn't come from isolation, but from irresistible gossip and cleverly stacked rocks. Picture a sleepy settlement nestled in the forested hills of what is now Central Europe. Snow falls like powdered sugar from the slate-grey sky, blanketing the rooftops, such as they were, in soft silence. Houses, if you could call them that, were squat, wooden affairs with wattle and daub walls and fashionably sloped thatch roofs, perfect for directing rain and melting snow off to the sides. The result was both practical and highly inconvenient for anyone standing too close to the eaves. Surprise showers were common, yet inside those earthy walls, warmth pulsed gently from central fire pits. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, boiled barley, and slightly damp wool. In this snug little world, extended families huddled together like a pack of sleepy hedgehogs, sharing not just body heat, but stories, stews, and the lingering aroma of onions someone tucked into their cooking pot 3 days ago and forgot to mention. Blankets were not just useful. They were triumphs of collective fussiness, woven mostly from wool, because sheep were shaggy little lifesavers. These blankets varied from coarse but cuddly to that one made by your cousin, who still doesn't understand how to keep the weave straight. No matter, in winter, warmth trumped aesthetics. Even the ugliest blanket was loved more than the prettiest neighbor once the frost truly settled in. Now, let's talk about insulation. It was less great insulation and more living embodiment of the phrase good enough. The daubed walls of Bronze Age homes were made from a charming cocktail of clay, straw, and, let's just acknowledge it, cow dung. Yes, cow dung. Flexible, adhesive, and surprisingly effective at holding in heat, while letting out only the faintest aroma of yesterday's pasture. But people didn't just rely on their homes to survive the snows. They also relied on each other. Communal living wasn't just practical, it was statistically warmer. More people meant more warmth, more labor to collect firewood, and more hands to point accusatorily when someone tried to sneak off and skip night fire duty. Imagine 12 people trying to sleep around a fire, snoring in discordant harmony, while one poor soul signaled the need for more fuel with a pointed cough. Ancient passive aggression, the original heating system. Let us now peer into their humble wardrobe, a wooden chest in the corner that groaned with winter garments. These weren't wardrobe choices so much as obligations. Woolen tunics, leather belts, and fur-trimmed cloaks. If you were fortunate, you might possess leggings made from woven plant fibers or sinewy leather, perfect for cold weather foraging or looking fashionably grizzled at the monthly village moot. Boots, glorious boots, were patchwork artifacts of practicality. Soft leather sewn with gut or sinew, sometimes fur-lined if you were lucky, or just the village cobbler could be bribed with enough honey. They weren't glamorous, but if your boots didn't leak by January, you were basically royalty. As for food preservation, the concept of refrigeration was simple. Just leave it outside and let the weather do the work. Root cellars were clever holes lined with straw, designed to protect perishables from freezing solid or disappearing mysteriously when the neighbors got desperate. Smoked meats hung from the rafters, a kind of meaty chandelier, while garlands of dried herbs and garlic clinked overhead like ancient culinary wind chimes. People dreamed in winter, not just about warmer days, but about boars fat enough to serve at the spring feast, or about the legendary time old Uncle Beric claimed he saw fire fall from the sky, and everyone agreed it was probably just me talking. Dreams gave warmth a lifeline into the coldest corners of the day, and when they weren't sleeping or scraping the frost off their morning stew, they were telling stories, tales of ice spirits and mountain wolves, of star-chosen warriors and goats who tricked greedy chieftains. Winter was the season of imagination, bound tightly in the balmy rhythm of stories shared beneath those drafty thatch ceilings. From managing drafts with thatch and dung, to hanging their sausages with purpose, our ancient European friends turned surviving the snow into an art form famously underappreciated by modern HVAC engineers. And speaking of warmth, the next fireside tale awaits, where we'll slip into the furs and political maneuverings of a winter court so chilly you could roast a turnip-sized grudge on it. High atop an alpine village tucked beneath a blanket of low-hanging snow clouds, the air hung heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional sputter from a hearth or the gentle crunch of snow under a boot. Here in the upper ridges of the Carpathians, winter did not politely knock. It burst in with icy boots and a frostbitten grin. Yet somehow people managed to survive, and not only survive, but sit through those long, sunless hours with stories, song, and fermented cabbage. Ah yes, sauerkraut. Crunchy, briny, sour like a peasant after tax day, it wasn't just a culinary choice. It was survival pickled and packed. The clever folk of Central and Eastern Europe learned quickly that if they wanted vitamin C without foraging through 3 feet of snow for the sad carcass of an old carrot, they'd better get fermenting. A barrel of sauerkraut might not warm your toes, but it might keep you from getting scurvy, which is arguably more important if you prefer a full set of teeth with your stew. And stew there was. Whether you were in the Tyrolean Alps or the snowy forests of Poland, winter food came in the form of bubbling cauldrons swelling with potatoes, turnips, and whatever unfortunate pig parts remained after the harvest festivals. Hearts, feet, tongues, they all found their place. If it could be stewed, it was stewed. If it couldn't, well, they probably tried anyway. Of course, not everyone had endless pigs to turn into foot soup. Villagers practiced the art of frugality with the discipline of monks. Every part of an animal was used. Intestines became sausage casings, bones seasoned broths, and hides turned into crude boots, or for the truly desperate, a sort of chewy winter snack. If it sounds grim, remember, it's hard to be picky when the nearest market is 6 days away by sled and wolf. Keeping warm was often a group activity. In many regions, families didn't just huddle together under blankets. They invited livestock to the coziness. Yes, cows in the ground floor rooms weren't just livestock, they were roommates. Their body heat kept the household warmer and, in an odd way, provided companionship during winter's social drought. Sheep, pigs, goats, as long as they didn't bite or chew through your bedroll, they were welcome. One young monk in 12th century Bavaria even wrote home to his mother that he spent the winter warming feet against the breath of our parish cow, which tells you everything you need to know about central heating in Europe before the Enlightenment. Some might say it was odd, others might say it was practical. Still others, particularly the modern veterinarian, might have a few concerns. Now, what of fashion in these frosty times? Before puffer coats and moisture-wicking thermals, ancient Europeans indulged in layers. So many layers. Tunics over woolen underwear, cloaks over tunics, furs over cloaks, and occasionally a second cloak for good luck. People walked around like ambulatory onion stacks, but at least they were warm and visually intimidating to snowdrifts. Furs, prized and essential, came from the small and fluffy heroes of winter fashion: rabbits, foxes, and the ever-fabulous ermine. Nobles draped them across their shoulders like trophies. Peasants sewed them into patchwork coats that made them resemble oddly mismatched bears. And both groups likely itched from fleas with admirable dignity. Windows, such as they were a bit of frozen comedy. Glass was an expensive luxury. So many homes relied on horn panes, or animal bladder stretched tight and oiled until semi-transparent. You could see shapes, maybe the vague hint of a tree, but mostly you saw blurry golden light filtered softly through the stomach of a sheep, a kind of medieval Instagram filter, if you will. And still, through all of it, the freezing fogs, bitter winds, and back-breaking shoveling of snow, people sang. Songs chased away the silence, and sometimes the wolves. Lullabies, drinking ditties, and tales about the sun returning were passed from fireside to fireside, proof that even the harshest winters couldn't freeze the joy of shared voices. Out in Scandinavia, they called it Jul, long before Christmas got its mittens on the name. A festival of warmth in midwinter, with feasting, firelight, and carved wooden goats. You know, just like your average holiday party. But even Jul had its practical roots. An excuse to gather, drink the fermented offerings of summer, share salted fish, and hold tight to laughter like it was warmer than wool. And with bellies warmed from root vegetable stews and mismatched fur coats brushing the floors, sleep came easily, curled beside cows, tucked beneath mama's patchwork hide blanket, lulled by tales of winters past, and snug in the heart of snow-glazed Europe. Winter waited patiently as one last log on the fire crackled to ash, while somewhere not far away, down a frostbitten trail lined with icicles like sleepy teeth, one very curious tradition about weather prediction was about to unfold. As winter's stillness blanketed the hills of Iron Age Europe, a strange and essential art took place beside the hearth. The moulding, tanning, and occasionally cursing of animal hides. For when snow fell knee-deep and the wind howled like a lonely ancestor, the survival of entire communities rather depended on whether someone, usually someone named Einar, Olga, or Wulfild, had stitched a believable pair of trousers out of sheep. Clothing wasn't fashion back then. It was life insurance, and the deductible was frostbite. While today we layer up in fleece and down, ancient Europeans had one primary rule. If it kept the livestock warm, it could probably do the same for a farmer. So, cloaks made from wool, tunics of linen, and the ever-fashionable fur-lined boots were favoured with a kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred relics or particularly hearty turnips. Wool, that miracle fibre born from stubborn sheep, was spun and woven into nearly every garment of note. It trapped heat, wicked moisture, and was notably flammable if you sat too close to the hearth, which, incidentally, was precisely where people clung like barn cats in January. But before the spinning came the shearing. Imagine, if you will, a wind-swept village square where a burly man is attempting to wrestle a disgruntled ram into something resembling cooperation. Shearing wasn't elegant. It was loud, woolly, and about as graceful as a goat on ice. But once the fleeces were gathered, cleaned, by soaking in increasingly hints of sheep water, and dyed with plant-based brews, they became robes, blankets, underpants, and, if cut improperly, very drafty skirts. The dyeing process itself was a feat of chemistry, both ancient and nose-crinkling. Madder root gave red, woad produced blue, and yellow came from weld ore for the more adventurous, onion skins. The vats used for dyeing sometimes smelled so fierce that even a Norseman would wrinkle his nose and mutter something about sleeping outside instead, providing it wasn't, 15 degrees. Layers were the name of winter's fashion game. A linen shift under a woolen tunic, topped with a heavy cloak that could double as a blanket, towel, windbreaker, and, if need be, a romantic picnic blanket, though not likely during blizzards. Footwear, meanwhile, was lovingly handcrafted or grumpily cobbled from leather and stuffed with straw, fur, or moss, these being the ancient equivalents of Dr. Scholl's insoles. The Romans, for all their marble this and aqueduct that, sometimes neglected proper winter shoes for their soldiers marching into cold, barbarian lands. The result? Many a Roman legionary developed the ancient military skill of tiptoeing while cursing under their breath in Latin. In households stretching from the Emerald Isles to the Slavic forests, children were tightly bundled like grain sacks on the move. There was no shame in wearing your older brother's tunic, especially when the only alternative was turning blue and having your mother rub you with goose fat in the old way. A tradition not endorsed by modern dermatologists, but the greatest invention by far, more cherished than mittens, more revered than thick socks, was the hood. Sometimes attached to cloaks, sometimes separate little pointed caps, hoods kept ears from falling off and minds from escaping into wind-blasted madness. It's believed that the humble hood, with its cozy sanctuary for the head, is a distant ancestor of the modern hoodie. Yes, before it was favoured by skaters and students, the hoodie was an indispensable tool in outwitting the North Sea's icy tantrums. Of course, not everyone had access to fine cloth or thick furs. The poorer folk had to make do with what they had, often repurposing sacking, layering whatever scraps could be found, and huddling together for warmth like a family-sized burrito. In fact, communal sleeping wasn't just a social gesture, it was a thermal strategy. In some places, they even lined their clothes with bits of paper or straw. It helped, but also turned walking across rooms into a symphony of crunches that must have driven the dog mad. And as the last embers dimmed in the longhouse hearth, for most, the final layers of winter clothing weren't garments at all, but simple, heavy quilts built from years of patchwork, fabrics that carried memory in every stitch and a little bit of toast crumb in every fold. But warm as all those cloaks may have been, no outfit could truly insulate a person from the mischief of another great winter adversary, drafty architecture, which, as we'll discover next, required creativity, quick thinking, and at least 3 door snakes made out of woven socks. The fire crackles like a gossiping aunt in the corner of a wooden hut, casting fluttery shadows over low beams and fur-lined cloaks. Outside, the snow continues its month-long performance, falling silently over the thatched rooftops of a sleepy village nestled somewhere in what is now Germany, but back then was known only in far more guttural syllables. Within, a family of 6 snoozes in what you might generously call a bed, but is technically more hay than mattress, more shared than personal. They sleep next to each other like mismatched spoons in a wooden drawer. Grandfather tucked under an elk hide, the youngest child curled around a bread crust like it's a teddy bear. Winter in ancient Europe, especially in the early medieval patchwork of tribal territories, was not so much survived as it was strategically ignored. You didn't fight the cold. You simply became smaller than it, sleep more, speak less, bathe rarely. There was a term for this long, corny nap, wintering. And it wasn't just a cozy trend, it was an absolute lifestyle. Think of it as the early European edition of hibernation, minus the biologically convenient ability to metabolize body fat for weeks on end. Instead, humans compensated with fat sausages, thick stews, and occasionally entirely fictional saints who may have miraculously multiplied root vegetables when supplies ran low. During these long winters, daylight was a rumour. Most areas above the 50th parallel might see the sun for what felt like 15 minutes, usually buried in a dense cloak of fog. Filtering through in such an apologetic way it barely counted. Candles, if you were wealthy or ecclesiastically inclined, provided light, but for your standard cow commuting crofter, a fire and a few flaming bits of animal tallow were the household's pride and ill-smelling joy. That meant daily rhythms were governed not by prisms of productivity, but by how efficiently you could avoid freezing your eyebrows off. Chores were minimal, movement was discouraged, and conversation was usually practical. No one wanted to waste breath in -10 degrees Celsius, especially if that breath just fogged up your only tiny window. Much of the time was spent repairing tools, darning socks that had absolutely betrayed you last week, and trying to ignore that your cousin had taken to composing crude winter haikus in the corner. Personal hygiene. Let's just say spa days were few. Bathing in deep winter was considered somewhere between reckless and death-wishy. Getting wet could mean literal frostbite in intimate places. Wise villagers practiced the noble art of the dry rub with snow, which feels spiritually akin to exfoliating with frozen breadcrumbs. Some even scented their clothing, yes, usually wool or linen, with dried herbs, not because anyone was particularly trying to impress each other, but because thyme and sage were less offensive than 3-month-old sweat. Still, not all was bleak and bone-chilling. Northern European communities, especially the Norse, found creative ways to trick winter into a tolerable houseguest. The poetry of skalds, Iceland's medieval rap battle specialists, grew richer by firelight. Elders told long, morally ambiguous tales involving trolls, beautiful princesses with questionable agency, and lots of accidental sibling slaying. Children learned how to mend, cook, knit, and, most importantly, how to sneak an extra turnip from the root cellar without becoming a parable in tomorrow's tale. For warmth and sanity alike, people gathered. In longhouses or stone cottages blackened by decades of smoke, 3 or more families might bunk up together, transforming a cold season into one extended foot-smushing slumber party. Musical instruments, whatever hadn't frozen or splintered, were played. Lyres, flutes made from animal bones, and drums gently thudded beneath layers of straw. And yes, there may have been drinking, but we'll save the delightful surprise of early medieval brewing wisdom for next time. Still, amid the cold, the crowding, and the continuous challenge of staying only marginally damp, winter had a strange way of bringing people closer, literally and emotionally. It was a season not of suffering, but of patience, of listening. One in which stories wrapped tighter than woolen scarves, and even the wind, ever howling at the edges of wooden doors, sounded a little more like a lullaby. And so, with the hearth still warm, and the snow still falling in dreams beyond the timbered walls, let us drift gently forward to a moment when food became alchemy, and the winter table more strategic than the battlefield. If you stepped into a medieval European home in the dead of winter, your nose might register a medley of smells: smoke, onions, wet wool, and just a whisper of damp earth. It wasn't unpleasant if you liked your room smoky and your onions unwashed, but this was the season known less for glamour and more for pure survival. The time when the sun clocked out early, and the biggest threat wasn't some neighbouring warlord, but your own frostbitten toes. Most ancient Europeans weren't galloping through snow-covered forests with spears and sled dogs. No, they were much more likely to be huddled in a one-room house, wrapped in layers of itchy homespun wool, trying not to freeze in the company of their extended family, a few chickens, and possibly a goat named Margarita. The architecture of warmth, if we may call it that, was as creative as it was smoky. Think thatched roofs stuffed thick with straw, stone or timber walls sealed with a charmingly earthy paste of mud, animal dung, and occasionally human inventiveness. The kinds of homes where wind could still sneak in, but warm air was coaxed to linger a little longer if you didn't open the door more than, say, once a month. Central heating, of course, didn't exist, but humans have always had a certain flair for staying alive in inconvenient weather. Enter the heart of the home and also its lungs, because everything, cooking, heating, boiling, drying, warming, happened over open flame. If you were particularly lucky, there might be a primitive chimney. Otherwise, the smoke simply took its time swirling toward the ceiling and eventually out a hole, probably making your eyes water and your hair smell like smoked cabbage along the way. During the colder months, everyone, and we do mean everyone, slept as close to the fire as civilization would allow without outright combustion. Beds were shared, layered with straw mattresses and covered in heavy woolen blankets, animal pelts, and whatever else could be draped over chilly limbs. Infants, elders, and anyone with a particularly shivery disposition were placed closest to the fire, along with bread dough left to rise slowly overnight. Priorities clearly understood. And there were cloaks. Glorious heavy cloaks made of wool, fur, or whatever the neighbors weren't fast enough to hide. These cloaks weren't fashion statements so much as portable survival tubes. You didn't just wear them outside. You wore them to dinner, to bed, to argue with your spouse. It was less a garment, more a lifestyle. Let's not forget about winter food, though forgetfulness was less likely when boiled turnips were a nightly affair. The fare was honest, hardy, and usually beige. Root vegetables that lasted forever, or at least until the next spring. Thick stews with mysterious floating bits, and bread that could double as a blunt instrument if diplomacy failed. Meat, if available, came from animals slaughtered before the first snow and preserved by smoking, salting, or burying in snow-packed cellars, a sort of ancient, meat-flavored igloo. Drinks helped too. Not so much the tea or hot cocoa of today, but rather mulled ale, spiced wine, or a fermented barley beverage that tasted like someone had misunderstood the concept of soup but leaned into it. Warm, vaguely alcoholic, and enough to make you forget that your toes were auditioning for ice sculpture duty. Then there were the practical traditions that bordered on charming. People blocked drafts with straw-stuffed cloth snakes beneath doors. Beds were built into nooks near the kitchen to share any fledgling warmth. Kids were bundled up in so many layers they moved like small, disgruntled bags of laundry. And on particularly frigid days, the family dog was promoted to chief warmth officer, encouraged to sleep inside for the benefit of everyone's feet and spirits. And when even that didn't suffice, humans did what humans do best. They told stories. In the long, dark evenings, by flickering firelight, surrounded by the aromas of onions, smoke, and damp wool, they entertained each other with tales of past winters, misbehaving spirits, or nights too foolish to build proper roofs. It was an act equal parts warmth and wisdom, recycling the past to survive the present, with a touch of amusement thrown in for chilly good measure. And through all this wintry perseverance, they began to listen to something else, the pacing of the season itself. A long, quiet rhythm of waiting, of sleeping longer, moving slower, sharing more. A time when even survival curled up by the fire to doze off, if only for a little while. As the fire dims low and woolen cloaks are resettled on sleepy shoulders, we tiptoe gently into the next part of this winter journey, where warmth takes on new forms and tradition meets a surprisingly cozy twist. While much of the ancient European winter survival strategy involved the practical, food storage, thick fur wraps, and the stubborn refusal to perish, some of the most whimsical defenses came straight from the realm of ritual, superstition, and seasonal storytelling. In places where the night stretched long and daylight took rather extended holidays, people didn't just wait out the dark. They filled it with meaning, mischief, and surprisingly elaborate costumes. In the high Alps, where everything froze except people's abilities to wear masks and frighten children, the folk of yore invented Krampus. Yes, that Krampus, half goat, half demon, all holiday cheer. While the neighbour's goat was mostly content to eat your turnips and headbutt the shed, Krampus was a festive entity you invited into your seasonal imagination. He was said to stalk naughty children with a bundle of birch branches and a set of clanking chains, which is precisely the sort of comforting thought you'd want as you tucked into straw bedding while winds howled outside. And yet, Krampus was just one of many strange Yuletide figures wandering Europe's sleepy corners. In Iceland, winter nights brought stories of the Jólakötturinn, the Yule cat, a monstrous feline who prowled the snowy countryside and, for reasons only known to felines and ancient Icelandic grandmothers, devoured people who didn't receive new clothes for Christmas. It was less of a fashion critique and more of a gentle encouragement to, knit something. In reality, it was a cozy tradition stitched together to motivate productivity during the dark months, spin wool, weave, or face mildly existential threats from supernatural cats. But beyond the occasional folklore beastie, let's drift gently into the warm amber glow of ancient European hearths. Hearths, dear listener, were the fireplace's charismatic older cousin. They warmed the home, cooked the gruel, and acted as the original social network, albeit one with less gossip and more firewood. In Celtic cultures, the hearth was sacred. Fire was not merely practical, it was spiritual. The flame in the center of the home was considered a living connection to Brigid, the goddess of the hearth, healing, and, coincidentally, poets. One could argue that she sponsored quite a few damp, wool-clad wordsmiths who whispered verses to peat smoke curls while waiting for their barley porridge to congeal. If you had wandered through a Germanic village on a deep winter night, cozy scarf barely shielding you from the cold, boots crunching on frost, you might have heard the rhythmic drone of song rising from timber houses. These were not carols, not exactly. They were the long, meandering tunes of wassailers, bearing jugs of spiced ale and a staggering determination to spread cheer. Whether or not their neighbours wanted it, wassailing was, historically, a practice of blessing the community's cider trees. Yes, people sang to trees. In the frigid January orchard, groups would gather with ale and song, coaxing apple trees to bear fruit in the coming year. By the third mug of warm brew, everyone believed the trees were very moved indeed. And as for the famous Scandinavian practice of lighting up the gloom, enter the tradition of the Yule log. Though now reduced to dessert form or the background of a particularly cozy Netflix special, the original Yule log was enormous. It was meant to burn steadily for 12 days straight, a glowing symbol of continuity, and just possibly an excuse to avoid going outside until February. But winters weren't all about surviving. Sometimes they were for dreaming. Snow muffled sound, but amplified the stars. In longhouses in the north or Roman villas down south, people shared stories, myths, and medical opinions like, add boiling cabbage to your boots to fight colds. They meant well. And wrapped in wool and skins, they believed that the darkest night could still be warm if filled with enough company, enough tales, and at least one slightly alarming folkloric creature watching from the woods. Even sleep, in those days, often came in shifts. The concept of a full 8-hour sleep was more modern than we think. Back then, you might fall asleep after sundown, wake in twilight to stir coals or whisper with a neighbour, and sleep again before dawn came grey and slow. The night had intermissions, a gentle pause in the long concert of winter. And now, as the embers of firelight filter through our imagination and soft frost climbs the corners of dream, perhaps it's time to follow those sleepy ancients under woolen blankets and drift toward quieter things, where coats of fur are traded for cloaks of slumber. Speaking of fur, there's an unusually clever tradition involving midwinter garments, and perhaps a sheep or two, waiting just ahead. As the dark of winter settled like velvet over the icy hills of medieval Scandinavia, something marvelous stirred beneath the snow. Not elves, I'm afraid, though they would have been convenient. No, what stirred was far more practical and slightly smellier. Fermented fish, woolen mittens crusted with frost, and the unmistakable crackle of ingenuity cooked over a peat fire. In the far reaches of northern Europe, winter wasn't just a season. It was a tyrant that stayed too long, tracked snow across the carpet of daily life, and asked for second helpings at dinner. Temperatures could plunge lower than a squirrel's basement, and daylight grew stingy, offering a miserly few hours of golden gloom before sinking behind the horizon in protest. Yet somehow, even without central heating, thermal underwear, or the noisy glory of space heaters, people survived, thrived even. And while their methods were, let's call them rustic, they were also undeniably clever. Take, for instance, the architectural genius of the Norse longhouse. Imagine a roomy wooden hall packed to bursting with people, animals, laughter, soup, smoke, and the occasional argument over who stole whose sock. These longhouses were designed like a slow cooker. Low ceilings, thick thatch roofs, and walls insulated with turf. Heat was kept in, cold was kept out, and odours, well, they were immunologically educational. Livestock often shared living quarters with humans, not because chickens make great conversation, but because they're wonderfully warm. A sleeping cow emits more heat than the average medieval mother-in-law and is generally less judgmental. Sheep, goats, and pigs contributed their own thermal presence, not to mention the bonus of waking up to breakfast already in the room. Farm to table was truly just table. Clothing, too, played a heroic role. Wool was winter's ultimate sidekick. Spun thickly and layered generously, it retained body heat even when wet. And no, they didn't have fleece, unless you count the actual sheep. Hats and mittens weren't just accessories. They were survival tools, hand-knit by candlelight, while the household gathered close to share stories, patch tunics, and perhaps sneak a swig of mead when no one was looking. And let's linger, just for a moment, by the hearth. The hearth wasn't merely a place for bubbling stew and dropped spoons. It was the radiant heart of the winter home, both physically and spiritually. Suspended metal pots swung over crackling flames, where thick stews of barley, dried vegetables, and preserved meats simmered slowly, long enough to soften even the sternest root vegetable into submission. Light from the fire danced across bundled faces, casting shadows that made Grandma's nose look exaggeratedly heroic. Children snuggled under fir throws, learning ancient sagas or being scolded in soft tones for attempting to roast turnips on their own. Oh, and lighting. Once the sun slunk off into its icy slumber, indoor life was lit by rushlights, tallow candles, and an occasional oil lamp, each sputtering and flickering like they were auditioning for a part in a spooky tale. The darkness was not feared exactly, but respected the way one respects soup that's gotten quietly lukewarm, unwelcome, but not worth hollering over. Among the cleverest innovations of all was the classic practice of nightcaps. Not the hat, though they wore those too, but the fortified bedtime drink. A small cup of warm ale or spiced wine soothed chilled bones and made sleep come quicker, walking hand in hand with dreams of warmer seasons and somewhat cleaner clothes. And speaking of dreams, let's not overlook the glorious medieval bed strategy. Beds, when they existed, were not solitary affairs. Entire families, and sometimes their goats, would pile in under heaps of blankets, pelts, and moth-nibbled wisdom. Privacy was unheard of unless you were a noble, and, even then, your guest might be sleeping in the bed next to you, snoring in harmony like a church choir with sinus issues. Yes, winters were long, cold, and occasionally involved mysterious illnesses with names that sounded like characters from a fairy tale. But they were also periods of powerful community, a shared slowing down. The snow may have pressed its whiteness against the windows, but inside the flickering glow, people told stories, knitted new garments, dreamed of summer markets and sun-warmed meadows. And that is the enduring marvel of it all. For every brutal wind that rattled the shutters, there was a bowl of hot stew, a woolen sock, and an auntie who could tell you what dreams meant based on whether you'd eaten cheese that day. Now, as the firewood shrinks and the moon rises higher, let's shuffle on gently to see what winter mischief those in Eastern Europe were up to, huddled between snowdrifts and steaming cauldrons. As the snow blanketed the roofs of timber-framed cottages and drafty longhouses, our ancient European ancestors turned, quite logically, to one of humankind's most time-honored traditions for surviving winter, doing as little as possible. In truth, winter in early Europe was less of a season and more of a strategic retreat. Daylight had the enthusiasm of a teenager doing chores, rising slowly and disappearing quickly, while temperatures hovered somewhere between brisk and hypothermia with a chance of frostbite. So people hunkered down, embracing the noble art of semi-hibernation, though without the luxury of YouTube playlists and heated blankets. Now, much of Europe, especially in the northern and central parts, was not known for tropical breezes. Winters could be biting, with blizzards that made travel inadvisable and wood smoke curling like sleepy thoughts from chimneys. Agricultural activity was impossible, unless one counted watching stored turnips with profound suspicion. So what did people do all winter? First, and most importantly, they stored food with all the paranoid foresight of a squirrel preparing for the apocalypse. In fact, the original prepper might very well have lived in a 9th century Alpine village, guarding his smoked sausages with suspicious eyes. Grains were dried, salted meats were suspended from rafters like spicy icicles, and root vegetables slumbered in cellars so cold and dark they probably composed minor poetry out of despair. But amid the chill and quiet, winter was also a time for storytelling. With the fields asleep and the tasks reduced to fetching firewood and dressing in progressively more layers, families gathered close around hearth fires. In a time before Netflix, there were only 3 channels available: local gossip, folklore, and someone trying to sing in a language they only half remembered. Elderly grandmothers, their voices softer than the snow falling outside, would recount tales of frost spirits and heroic potatoes. Yes, potatoes. Though technically, they wouldn't emigrate from South America until centuries later, which means old European tales were largely tuber-free unless someone was very confused or very drunk on mead. Sleeping quarters were often shared. That's communal body heat in medieval survival parlance. Beds were piled with every available layer: animal skins, straw mattresses, rough-spun wool, and occasionally small dogs, whose warmth essentially paid their rent. Fireplaces, at this point, were helpful but not comforting. In many homes, particularly during the medieval period, smoke had an unpredictable relationship with chimneys, largely because chimneys were still something of a novelty. And in older homes, the smoke simply rose into the rafters, where, with some luck, it annoyed the mice before escaping through the thatch. Now, mind you, there was no insulation, no double glazing, No fuzzy socks made from synthetic fibers engineered to trap warmth like a greedy little bear hug. People wore layers of rough cloth and wool, the kind of fabric that might itch your soul a little, but at least it kept the cold from winning entirely. Children would be wrapped up like sausages, only entirely unappetizing, and residents wore nightcaps not for fashion, but because losing the top of your ears to frostbite while dreaming was considered impolite. The season also inspired creativity. In longhouses and cloistered monasteries, folks carved wood, spun yarn, brewed ale, and, on particularly ambitious afternoons, attempted to fix broken tools, only to use more swearing than actual improvement. In such moments, winter was not just endured, it was woven into the very culture. And yet, despite all this discomfort, or perhaps because of it, there was a unique kind of peace in that sleepy, frost-swept world. Life slowed. People rested. The rhythm of the year called for silence, and they answered it not with resistance, but with blankets, warm cups of fermented something, and long hours of communal sitting. Outdoor work might grind to a halt, sure, but indoor life still hummed quietly along. People found solace not in doing, but in being. Being near the fire, being near family, being reasonably sure that yes, that clump in the stew was probably edible. And somewhere outside, snow drifted against stone walls, wound its way around wood piles, and muffled the world like time had laid a downy quilt over the village. Tomorrow, we might peek inside one of the few places that still welcomed a little chaos during these quiet winters. The bustling, surprisingly lively world of ancient markets that braved the frost. Quietly now. It's nearly time. There is a special kind of silence after a heavy snowfall. The kind that muffles the world into a hush so still, one might believe time had curled up like a cat in a basket and decided not to move until spring. In the quiet valleys of medieval Bavaria or the frost-blanketed forests of early Poland, this quiet was not so much poetic as it was practical. It meant sound didn't travel well, limbs didn't move easily, and the dairy cow had likely stopped producing anything but disappointed glances. And into this long hush stepped an unlikely winter hero. The sleigh bell. Yes, the jingling ones. It wasn't just a catchy Christmas tune in embryo, it was a necessity. Sleigh bells helped announce your presence in the muffled winter world. Not for aesthetics, but because being hit by a horse-drawn sled on a blind curve in the frozen woods was only funny if you weren't the person pancaked. European travelers, especially those in places like Scandinavia and Russia, where snow and long-distance journeys went together like wool and itchiness, found bells to be both practical and, let's face it, a little whimsical. There's something soothing in the thought that even a 14th century merchant, bundled like a cabbage in layers of wool and fur, might have jingled quietly as he trudged over icy roads, carrying salted fish and hope. Of course, most people didn't travel much in winter. They stayed home. And staying home in 14th century Ireland or Hungary didn't mean Netflix and stew. It meant holing up in a wooden or stone hut, usually with one main room, a central hearth, and approximately 4 too many family members per square foot. If you'd like a visual comparison, imagine being stuck in a rustic bread box with your in-laws, 2 pigs, and the unshakable scent of turnips. And yet, within those cramped walls, winter lives unfolded with surprising coziness. Families slept together, children, grandparents, and sometimes animals, sharing warmth like ingredients in a communal soup. Beds were often built like boxes with short walls, not because medieval people feared rolling off onto the floor, though stubbed toes were indeed feared, but to better contain heat. In fact, some beds could be closed with curtains or even little doors, transforming them into what can only be described as early sleeping pods, minus the Bluetooth. The fireplace, naturally, was the heartbeat of the home. It cooked, illuminated, and occasionally attacked when improperly maintained. But it wasn't alone in its heat-producing duties. Enter the hot stone, not unlike a prehistoric water bottle, minus the squish. People would heat smooth rocks in the fire, wrap them in cloth, and tuck them into beds or cradles. The first person to put a toasty stone under a child's bottom likely received the medieval equivalent of a Nobel Prize, or at least a very long nap. And then there was the matter of food, or to be precise, the matter of not running out of it. By January, the root cellar had transformed from a place of plenty into a game of culinary roulette. You reached in, pulled out a vaguely potato-shaped object, and hoped it wasn't entirely inhabited by something else. Pickling, salting, drying, and fermenting were less trendy diet choices and more forms of national panic prevention. In snowy corners of northern France or Estonia, barrels of sauerkraut were the sign of a prepared household, and the absence of one was cause for slight alarm. Not because the cabbage was missed, emotionally speaking, but because it often stood between a meager family dinner and the need to chew one's boot very reflectively. Fermented beverages also made a reliable showing in winter months. Meads and ales, some strong, some suspiciously chewy, were not just for merriment. They were safer to drink than many sources of water and had the added bonus of scraping the edge off being snowed in with extended relatives who played the lute badly. Again, for the 6th night in a row. And yet, perhaps the most singularly surprising strategy for surviving snowy winters in ancient Europe was song, truly. Folk tunes and hymns passed from voice to voice like glowing embers, warmed otherwise cold evenings. The same voices that whispered lullabies over infants and sang laments by firesides were used to recall stories, spin myths, and cling to a sense of time, even when every day wore the same white cloak. With so much snow outside, and most of one's life reduced to the few feet around the hearth, these little comforts, the soft jingle of a bell, the toasty weight of a hot stone at your feet, the sour bite of pickled cabbage, or the rise and fall of your mother's voice, formed the thin, warm thread that stitched one winter to the next. And if you lean in a little closer, you might just hear the next one whispering through the snow-laced pine. Once the snow began to fall, and fall it did, like powdered sugar shaken by a nervous baker, life in ancient European villages shifted into what we might now call cozy survival mode. With fields buried, animals fluffed into woolly heaps, and days that barely stretched their legs before tipping into darkness, people turned to the noblest of human instincts, staying warm, staying fed, and telling a really good story to make the hours pass less frostily. Let's take a stroll, wool cloak wrapped tight, into a Celtic settlement in what we now call France, where oak walls creaked gently in the wind and smoke curled from thatched roofs like the lazy dreams of sleeping fires. By wintertime, the villagers had already packed away sacks of grain, cured meats, and the sort of root vegetables that look suspiciously like what's left over in your modern fridge drawer. Parched turnips, pickled cabbage, and dried peas. Ingredients not frequently spotted on Michelin-starred menus, but once indispensable to not freezing into a cranky, hungry statue by mid-January. Inside warmth was crafted with ingenuity more than abundance. Stone hearths blazed just enough to toast your shins, and clever insulation tricks, like hanging tapestries or stuffing moss into wall cracks, kept out the worst of the chill. Bedtime wasn't a single event. It was more like a rolling negotiation with the cold. People often slept, several to a bed, not necessarily for romance or family bonding, but for the unshakable luxury of another warm-blooded heat source. Nothing says bonding quite like walking up mid-dream to find cousin Elric's foot nestled under your chin. But even rugged societies need a bit of fantasy, and winter, with its long nights and muffled borders between dreams and reality, became the high season for imaginative storytelling. The bards knew this well. Whether wandering in sheepskin cloaks or settled by the fire with a priceless harp fashioned from old horsehair and excessive optimism, they spun tales that walked the shadowy seam between the known and the enchanted. They told of spirits who whispered in the pines, of great hounds with eyes like burning coals, of ancient gods slumbering beneath snowy hills, dreaming of spring. These stories served more than entertainment. They were maps of cultural memory, disguised as spooky distractions. And honestly, if you've ever been stuck indoors with 12 cousins and not enough fermented mead, you know the value of a good ghost story. Further east, in Slavic lands, the snow piled higher and the folklore deeper. There, the domovoi, house spirits with bushy beards and deeply particular tastes in cleanliness, were said to roam during winter months. To keep their tiny tempers even tinier, families left offerings tucked in the corners of the hearth. Bread crusts, spoonfuls of porridge, the occasional slice of sausage if they were feeling generous or particularly superstitious. And then there's the Scandinavian solution to winter, inventing personal fireballs. Not literally, though that would have been exciting, but in the form of the sauna. In Finland, for instance, people believed that the sauna wasn't just a place to sweat and chatter, but a sacred domain where spirits could be soothed and sin steamed gently off your soul. Sitting in 80-degree heat while snow howled outside. That wasn't just self-care. It was resilience, Scandinavian edition. But perhaps the coziest winter survival tactic of all was adjusting reality's expectations. Time became fluid. Without farming schedules, many ancient Europeans allowed themselves the luxury of segmented sleep. 2 chunks of slumber each night, divided by a period for quiet reflection, quiet conversation, or, if you were lucky, a bit of candlelit reading from the one family member who actually had letters under their belt. This mysterious middle-of-the-night pause was called the watch in many regions, not to be confused with the wristwatch, which would not be invented for several frustrating centuries. During those dark hours between dreams, with frost webbing the windows and the fire gently crackling, many felt closer to the realm of the sacred. Winter, for all its grip on the landscape, loosened its grip on time. There was room for thinking, or talking softly, or simply listening to the sound of wool shifting as someone turned in their sleep beside you. And so, as the snow continued to fall, and the villagers continued to mumble in their dreams, history cozied itself deeper into the blankets of winter, waiting for a sunbeam, a thaw, or perhaps just the next story to begin. Let's tiptoe onward now, as the coals turn to amber and the night shifts gently into deeper slumber. Far from the glamour of ancient battles and royal banquets, in the quieter corners of Europe's wintry past, there existed an object so humble, so profoundly ordinary, that it rarely found its way into epic poems or dusty scrolls, and yet it may have saved more toes than any glimmering sword ever did. Allow me to introduce the medieval sock. Now, let's not picture today's soft, elasticized bundles of cotton comfort. No, medieval socks, or hose if you wish to be ceremonious, were more like loosely committed fabric tubes with ambition. They ruffled and wrinkled, and depending on one's social class, were made of everything from fine silk to questionable wool that smelled faintly of damp cheese. But in the frozen silence of December in a 9th century hamlet, even the cheesiest wool was a gift from the gods. Villagers often made their own stockings by carefully felting sheep's wool, agitating it with warm water until it matted into a dense, insulating fabric that could trap heat like gossip in a small village. These homemade foot cocoons were then tucked into leather shoes or wooden clogs, which were about as ergonomic as a soup bowl. But collectively, they worked. Fashionable? Hardly. Functionally life-saving? Absolutely. And what delightful contraptions they were. Some versions even extended up past the knees and were cinched with garters. Long before garters were associated with weddings and mischief, these early garters were practical strings of twisted fibre or leather strips. Not exactly seductive, unless you're very into agricultural textiles. Further north, where winters behaved like feral beasts, people got dramatically creative. In Scandinavia, folks lined their shoes with layers of animal fur, sometimes on the outside, but importantly, sometimes on the inside too, because that's where your toes live. Reindeer fur was especially beloved for its warmth and was conveniently attached to creatures that you could also eat, ride, and befriend. A triple threat species. But footwear was only one part of the winter survival ensemble. Socks needed allies. Introducing another star of this snowy stage, the humble foot ointment. That's right. Before there were spa calendars or foot masks filled with lavender gel and optimism, there were rustic mixtures of animal fat and herbs, dutifully slathered onto soles to trap warmth and keep cracking skin at bay. A greasy foot may not have been romantic, but it was deeply practical, and possibly helped keep marriage rates up during January. In monasteries, where monks spent their lives chasing divinity and avoiding frostbite, sock making was both a necessity and a highly meditative task. The Benedictine rule, that sweeping medieval lifestyle guide for monastic living, encouraged manual labor. So monks might well spend a dark winter's afternoon spinning wool and muttering prayers, working to produce a pair of socks sturdier than most modern SUVs. And while feet were coddled with felt and fat, sleepwear was a more loose interpretation of comfort. For most peasants, sleepwear was just whatever you didn't get wet that day. Tunics became blankets. Cloaks were pulled tight across straw bedding, and the concept of pajamas, let alone matching pajama sets, was as foreign as dragons taking up embroidery. But the upper class, with their tapestried bedrooms and surplus fireplaces, enjoyed something far more fetching. The nightcap. Yes, that pointy little hat grandma knits in children's books had a real and respectable history. Its purpose? To prevent heat loss through the head. You see, despite what shampoo bottles tell you, hair does a terrible job insulating, especially if it's damp or thinning. So, people popped on long cotton or woolen caps like dreamy chimney sweeps, drifting into sleep wrapped in many layers and perhaps surrounded by a few friendly rodents. And if all else failed, and the socks were more whole than fabric, and the ointment was gone, and your only blanket had been chewed by goats, there was always the age-old tactic, sharing body heat. Families and even neighbors might huddle together under the same furs, exchanging awkward eye contact and a mutual understanding that dignity could wait until spring. Snow might pile against the door, hearths might sputter down to glowing embers, and sleep might come earlier and depart later. But through it all, the people of ancient Europe made it through their winters, one itchy sock and steaming foot balm at a time. And tomorrow, as the storm calms and the fire crackles, we'll wander into the heart of ancient kitchens, where winter menus heated both hearth and heart with bubbling simplicity. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear goatskin mittens and have soot on their noses from falling asleep too close to the hearth. As the snow thickened and the world narrowed into shades of white and thistle grey, medieval Europeans didn't just survive, they became winter artisans of coziness, early adopters of what we might call today the hibernate and hope for the best lifestyle. Among the lesser-known yet laughably effective winter strategies was something so fantastically low-tech. You'd think it came from a rustic fairy tale rather than a village record. The art of warming a bed with livestock. Yes, your eyes do not deceive you, friend. In certain corners of Northern Europe, where wood was scarce and winter enthusiasm scarcer, pigs or chickens were occasionally invited into the bedroom, not for moral support, but for thermal output. Picture a peasant family retiring for the night. Mother, father, 2 children, a confused hen, and a rather pleased pig, all bundled together under one oversized woolen blanket, like a very peculiar bedtime snack wrap. And while it might ruffle the feathers of modern building codes, that same hen was trusted to perform double duty. Heat source at night, eggs at dawn. Economical and cuddly, if you like scratchy feathers and the occasional sleepy squawking. Those fortunate enough to have some coin or favor with someone who did, had a slightly more refined ally against the bitter winds, the bedwagon. This delightfully medieval creation was basically a canopy bed encased in wooden paneling, like a wardrobe and a nap got together and had a baby. Curtains thick as sheep and carvings to rival a cathedral door. These beds were designed to trap the body heat of their tuckered-out occupants and hold onto it with the desperation of a bard on open mic night. Getting into one felt like sneaking into a fort made by your ancestors out of furniture and dreams. Wool was the reigning fabric empress, appearing in every possible form. Tunics, cloaks, socks, underpants that could double as modest tents in a blizzard. But those bursts of warm ingenuity didn't just stop at what people wore. No. Enter the foot warmer, a simple wooden box filled with hot coals, tucked under skirts or placed beneath dinner tables. Nothing says family bonding quite like everyone silently roasting their toes over the same mild fire hazard. Insulation, too, received some charmingly odd interpretations. Instead of modern fiberglass or foam, people often caulked houses with a mixture of straw, mud, and tightly wadded wool scraps. Some used moss. Others, brave or bored, tucked handfuls of dried herbs into the crevices of their wattle and daub walls. Whether this was for insulation or simply to cover up the scent of sleeping with livestock remains a heated academic debate. Or at least something historians chuckle about over medieval-themed coffee. But even the most rugged winter went better with a good bellyful of warmth. Stews became thicker. Porridge became, well, mostly still porridge, but dolled up with whatever winter spices could be found. Clove, nutmeg if you were lucky, or the ancient favourite, wild hope. Root vegetables stretched like elastic into everything. Ale was brewed darker. People drank mead not just for merriment, but because, quite frankly, by February, everyone was one goose feather short of snapping. And then there was storytelling. When the snow piled high and windows iced like frosted panes of sugar, when chores were finished and even the ambitions of goats fell quiet, that's when the real magic unfurled. Families huddled close by the fire, and stories came out like well-warmed bread, soft, strange, dripping with truths no longer burdened by fact. Tales of ancient heroes, of tricksters, of lost travelers guided home by the stars. Myths mixed with memories, and somewhere in the middle, you got a feeling that perhaps the cold wasn't something merely to survive. It was something to share. Because winter, left unchecked, can chew the edges off your spirit, but with warmth, wool, and a decently mannered pig, it became a season to be endured with equal parts humour and ingenuity. And just as the frost found cracks in even the tightest cabin, so too did laughter sneak into the quiet nights, through stories, jokes, and maybe a hiccup from the extra mug of mulled cider. The snow outside thickened, the wind whispered like old tales longing to be told again, and the people, huddled under hay-filled mattresses and dreams of the sun, pressed into the heart of winter with one simple promise: spring would come eventually. But tonight, they would be warm together. Now, if you're feeling cozy, don't drift off just yet. There's a final, sleepy discovery just ahead. When the snow softly blanketed the rooftops of medieval villages and the hearth crackled like a whispered lullaby, life in ancient Europe slowed into something close to hibernation. This last stretch of winter, the dimming candle of the coal season, was a time of patience more than panic. Survival had been secured by ingenuity, yes, but also by a stubborn, snowy sort of hope. Let's take you ever so gently into the heart of those long winters, to a world muffled in frost and comfort. In Scandinavia, they called the final weeks of snowdrift Goi, named after a frostbringer goddess who, despite her cold demeanour, was also associated with renewal. People offered prayers to her for a gentle thaw, though frankly, they would have preferred a direct line to the sun. Even then, they prepared ritual feasts, because if you were going to be trapped indoors with your relatives for months on end, you might as well distract yourself with roasted squirrel and cabbage beer. Meanwhile, in the Alps, when the winds howled across the peaks like hungry ghosts, families would sit close to the tiled stoves, those ceramic beasts of warmth that radiated heat for hours. Children would sometimes draw little faces in the frost along the windows, gossiping quietly about forest spirits or mischievous house elves who were probably tired of the same root stew again. And somewhere in the British Isles, where the winter slush clung stubbornly to your boots and your mood, communities passed the time by weaving tales with threads of firelight and gin, or honeyed ale if gin hadn't marched in yet. These stories were often wildly exaggerated versions of how great-grandfather Humphrey once kept 5 cows alive with nothing but a wooden spoon and a stern glare. By February, smoked meats began to look smaller, and jars of pickled turnips underwent intense democratic debates. Should we open the last one now, or wait until we start seeing our breath indoors? But the secret to survival, truly and sweetly, lay in what we might now call tiny acts of winter defiance. A warm stone slipped between sheets, blankets layered like geological strata, a bit of bread dipped in onion broth that somehow tasted better by candlelight, huddled conversation under low beams. These weren't just comforts, they were declarations of cleverness against the cold. Stoic monks, writing away in dim cloisters, would warm their ink with candlelight and insulate their scripts with the thickest Latin imaginable. Hoc est friginum probably wasn't real Latin, but who could dispute a monk desperate for spring? In Eastern Europe, particularly in Slavic regions, pagan remnants of winter festivals flared up. Rituals like burning Grandma Winter in effigy. True, setting a straw woman ablaze and dancing around her might make your neighbour suspicious. But when the lakes are frozen stiff and the goats have stopped caring entirely, a little theatrical catharsis keeps spirits buoyant. Even the animals knew the drill. Cats curled deeper into themselves, achieving an almost spherical uncaring. Chickens, veterans of at least 3 Februaries, laid fewer eggs on purpose, as if to say, "You deal with it, human. I've done my part." And the snow. Oh, the snow. By now, it had become a familiar roommate, uninvited, occasionally slushy, but sometimes, during those hushed twilight hours, strangely beautiful. Icicles clung like crystal daggers to the eaves, and moonlight added its silver hush to the world. At such moments, even the grumpiest goatherd might admit quietly that winter had its charms. The people of ancient Europe didn't just endure. The clever ones, the dreamers, they made art out of surviving. They turned hardship into hospitality, monotony into mythology, and discomfort into, well, slightly warmer discomfort with better company. And so, wrapped in furs, huddled in timbered homes with their barrel lids shut tight and their hopes quietly glowing, they waited for the first drip of melted snow, for the first crow cawing a little closer to the sun, for the first day the path no longer crunched like old bones. Spring would come. They knew it as surely as you know the blanket atop your legs or the pillow beneath your head. Close your eyes now. The winter has passed, and you, like the ancients, have made it through. Sleep well, time traveler. Until next season.